Hey, thanks for tuning in, and in this video we're going to be talking about employment law in the United States and how it relates to Sabbath observance. A lot of new observers of the Torah, newcomers to the Sabbath, run into an issue of, but my employer wants me to work on the Sabbath. Maybe we already were working on the Sabbath, or maybe our employer asked us to do it occasionally, and it just seems like we're not going to be able to get out of it. And we're going to be talking about some options for that, even if you have already talked with your employer and your employer has already insisted on it. First, let's define what Sabbath even means. Now, the Hebrew word Shabbat, from which the word Sabbath has been derived, actually literally means to cease. It means ceasing. And in context, we're talking about ceasing from work. Now, it's not just about being a church day, as some have interpreted it, or something like that. That's not actually what Sabbath is about. The Sabbath is about not working. It's about ceasing from work. It's about not doing our deeds. It's about not serving. Therefore, when we talk about remembering the Sabbath or keeping the Sabbath holy, it is in that context. It's in the context of working for 6 days, and on the 7th day of the week, we are to cease. We are to stop working. Whenever we start observing the Sabbath, and whenever we start trying to coordinate with our employer or coordinate with our boss or our work with how we are going to get the Sabbath off or something like that, a lot of times we kind of run into trouble and we're not really sure what to do. Because on the one hand, we've realized, yes, that God's law is important. Doing what the Father requires of us is very important, and it's something that we want to do. It's something we've realized needs to be done. But on the other hand, we kind of need money. We want to please our employer and not be perceived a certain way, and we want to fulfill prior obligations, and the employer may insist that they need the help, and maybe they do perceive they need the help, and maybe we've got issues with a boss that needs time off for her kids, needs time off to help with the family and all of that, but won't have it if we're not working on that day. And so, on the one hand, we want to be considerate of people and considerate of our needs as far as money and all of that. On the other hand, we know that what God wants is important, and we want to serve God. So, we've got this conflict, and a lot of people just feel stuck about it. They don't know what to do and don't perceive options. So we're going to talk about some of those options. But first, I want to talk to you about mindset before we get into those options. And I want you to consider the nature of the Sabbath command. The Sabbath is something that's reiterated over and over in the law, and its seriousness is reiterated in the law. And in fact, the punishment for breaking the Sabbath, the punishment for working on the Sabbath, is actually capital punishment. So obviously, that's a pretty serious thing. That's obviously considered a pretty important command if God is insisting that this is the punishment for violating it. So he obviously does not want us to violate it. He obviously wants it to be kept, and there aren't these exceptions built into it like some people seem to want to be built into it. It's not about pulling our neighbor's ox out of the ditch, or it's not about doing good on the Sabbath or something like that. It's not about those things. Working on the Sabbath is violating the command. Serving on the Sabbath, doing our deeds on the Sabbath is violating the command. It's not about doing good. It is violation. It's not allowed. As I said, the punishment for violating the Sabbath, for working on the Sabbath, is capital punishment. Let's consider some other commands that have capital punishment tied to them. We might consider commands like murder, adultery, bestiality, among others. Now, in our minds, we might consider those commands, and we might think about, murder and adultery and bestiality, those are big deals, those are things I would never want to do. And we might look at the Sabbath, and because of prior conditioning, prior beliefs, we might think it's not on the same level. The thing is that if we look at the law, if we look at the text of the law, it has the same punishment. It has essentially the same punishment. And so would that not imply that it is of similar importance to God? Would that not imply that we should be considering it very seriously? And indeed, the Sabbath is a very serious issue. If your employer asked you and said, hey, I really need you to murder this guy, and you need to do it in order to keep your job, or something like that, or I really need you to commit bestiality or commit adultery in order to keep your job, would we want to do that? And for most of us, the answer is going to be no. Well, it's obvious we wouldn't want to do it. But it's easy to say that when we're not in the moment. It's easy to say that when we're thinking about those sorts of things. But when we think about observing the Sabbath, we may not exactly equate that in our minds yet with being so serious. However, it is a very serious issue. It's very important, and it is re-emphasized over and over in the law. So obviously, if we have an employer that's insisting we do things that are punishable by death, we're not going to want to be a part of that organization anymore if that is indeed a condition of employment. Now, it might seem not realistic to people, or oh, it's a matter of life kind of thing. It's a matter of maintaining your life in order to maintain that job that requires you to violate God's commands. And yeah, it is a matter of life. Think about that. But let me assure you that if you live in the United States, and maybe in other countries too, you probably won't have to quit your job or anything like that. You may have options that you didn't realize you had. You may be able to get the Sabbath off with your current employer. So let's move on to talking about United States employment law. I want to offer some clarifications before we start talking about U.S. employment law. First, I'm not a lawyer. That being said, you can easily go to eeoc.gov and get all the information that we're going to talk about here, and you can even get contact information on their website if you choose to go that route. Now, that being said, I am not advocating that we go file an anti-discrimination suit or anything like that. I'm not advocating that at all. Instead, I am going to make you aware of what the law actually protects you from and what the law actually supports you in, the U.S. law, in observing the Sabbath and observing the Torah in general. Now also, you may have certain political leanings, as I have in the past, that would dictate that we're opposed to these sorts of things. So there might be some kind of resistance to even looking into this sort of thing, but I recommend that you discard your political views for the time being, because what is really important? What's really important is that we're obeying God's commands. And so in this case, the U.S. law is on your side in obeying God's commands, and we're going to talk about that. Let's look at Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Title VII is kind of the foundational piece of legislation in anti-discrimination, and most often we look at it in regard to discrimination against race and ethnic origin and that sort of thing, but it also relates to us. It relates to us in terms of religious observance. Now, we need to clarify what employers are according to this law. Not everyone falls under employer just because they have an employee. Not everyone falls under that definition of employer. Now, you can look at the exact specifics for yourself, but essentially an employer is generally defined as someone who employs 15 or more people per day on most days of the year. You can get the exact details of that on their website. So what does Title VII say that pertains to us? Title VII says, "It shall be an unlawful employment practice for an employer, 1, to fail or refuse to hire or to discharge any individual, or otherwise to discriminate against any individual with respect to his compensation, terms, conditions, or privileges of employment, because of such individual's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Or 2, to limit, segregate, or classify his employees or applicants for employment in any way which would deprive or tend to deprive any individual of employment opportunities or otherwise adversely affect his status as an employee because of such individual's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. So Title VII is very clear that the U.S. does not want employers in general, to discriminate based upon religious observance, and that includes hiring, firing, conditions of employment, and all of that. So the law is already on our side in this regard, and let's talk about some more details that are given. You can easily find this on the eeoc.gov website by going to Employees and Applicants, and then going down to Discrimination by Type, Religion. The EEOC states that, quote, "The law requires an employer or other covered entity to reasonably accommodate an employee's religious beliefs or practices, unless doing so would cause more than a minimal burden on the operations of the employer's business. This means an employer may be required to make reasonable adjustments to the work environment that will allow an employee to practice his or her religion." Examples of some common religious accommodations include flexible scheduling, voluntary shift substitutions or swaps, job reassignments and modifications to workplace policies or practices. Also, unless it would be an undue hardship on the employer's operation of its business, an employer must reasonably accommodate an employee's religious beliefs or practices. This applies not only to schedule changes or leave for religious observances, but also to such things as dress or grooming practices that an employee has for religious reasons. U.S. employment law is on our side because not only are we allowed to get flexible scheduling and have that expectation that we would get the Sabbath off and also the feast days and other observances, but also there's an expectation that we could get accommodations for grooming or dress. For example, something like wearing the tassels, the tzitzit. Let's also talk about disparate impact. Now, disparate impact is a type of discrimination that might be unintentional. Say an employer insists that everyone that works for them works on the seventh day of the week. Say an employer has that policy as just a matter of employment policy, a matter of hiring someone or firing someone. Well, they may not think, hey, let's keep all Torah observers from working here or anything like that. They're probably not thinking that. They're probably thinking, well, we need this because we're retail or something like that. But even if they aren't intentionally discriminating against people, it can still be considered discriminatory. It can still be considered disparate impact because it has a disparate impact upon a protected group of people just by enforcing their policy. So they're not intentionally saying no Sabbath observers allowed, but because their practices kind of promote that result, it is considered discriminatory even if it's not intentional. And the EEOC says this about disparate impact: an unlawful employment practice based on disparate impact is established under this subchapter only if a complaining party demonstrates that a respondent uses a particular employment practice that causes a disparate impact on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and the respondent fails to demonstrate that the challenged practice is job-related for the position in question and consistent with business necessity. Now, typically speaking, to address the business necessity part, as we saw before, having people work on the Sabbath and not allowing flexible hours or not allowing shift swaps or something like that, that generally speaking is not considered business necessity. It's not considered a necessity to the business, to the employers of this size that we're speaking of. So in most cases, it's not going to be a business necessity that our employer does not allow Sabbath observers or something like that. That's typically not going to be the situation. Now, once again, I'm not telling you this to get you to go file a discrimination suit or anything like that, far from it. But the reason that I'm telling you this is to change your mindset about things. Because a lot of people have the experience, and these are things that I've heard personally from people I know who observe the Sabbath, they've had their employers say, there's no way we can let you off because we're retail, or something like that. There's no way you can get that off. We require everyone to work on that day. We require everyone to work on the Sabbath, kind of thing. Businesses will tell you this, employers will tell you this, but in my experience, if you stand firm and tell them why you need it off, they will typically allow you to get it off. So for example, my personal experience, I set up my availability to where I couldn't have any work on the Sabbath, kind of thing. And whenever I actually came in, the employer gave me the schedule and said, here you go, you're working on the 7th day of the week, kind of thing. And I said, well, that is the Sabbath. I observe the Sabbath. And they told me, okay, well, that's the only reason that we'll allow you off for. And I've heard of similar experiences as well. Other people saying that we require everyone to work on that day and that sort of thing. But when they tell them why they need it off and they insist and stand firm that they need that off, then the employer knows that they need to let you off, because a lot of them are afraid of the EEOC and the employment law issues. Let's also consider what an employer has gone through potentially in the past in regard to this issue. For example, in my area, which is the Bible Belt area, there are probably a lot of Christians that ask and say, hey, we need the first day of the week off to observe church or to go to church or whatever. And the employer knows that, at least with most of them, if they tell them, no, we need you to come in maybe some other time, but we need you to come in this time, they know that these people typically cave. It's not something that they insist needs to be done. It's something they request, and they feel like they don't have options, kind of like some of us have felt. And they feel like they can't do anything other than what the employer orders them to do. So employers' experience a lot of times is that, hey, if you pressure people, if you say, no, we need you to come in, that a lot of times they're just going to cave and they're going to come in. And so they won't need to change the schedule, or they won't need to figure out someone else to switch with or anything like that. So employer knows the easiest path for them typically is to tell you that, no, you're not allowed to, you have to come in on the Sabbath or first day of the week or whatever. So a lot of times all we need to do is just be firm in our resolve and insist that, yes, this is a closely held religious belief. I know a lot of people don't like the word religious, but I would strongly encourage you to use that word in this situation, because that is the way that the EEOC refers to it. That is the way that the employment law is worded, is it uses the word religion. So even if you don't like the word religion, make sure you go ahead and use it in this way, because it has a legal connotation to it. Another thing you may consider in regard to the first day of the week is a lot of people want off for the first day of the week. And so if you offer your employer and say, hey, I can't work on the 7th day, but I'll work on the first day of the week, that might kind of ease some of the tension, and they might be a little more okay with accommodating you in that regard. However, once again, that's not necessarily the requirement. It's just that may help to kind of smooth things over if there was any resistance to it. However, the employment law is clear that they need to allow you to take off if they are qualified as an employer under the law. And the reason I share this with you once again is not to tell you to go sue someone that doesn't listen to you or something like that, but instead to encourage you that you do have options. You do have the ability to stand firm, and your employer may have told you before, or may have told you already that no, you can't have the 7th day off, or something like that. They may have told you that already, but you need to make it clear to them that you need it off and that you know your rights. Now, you don't have to threaten them or anything like that. Usually, all that you need to do is just stand firm and explain the reason why you need it off. Usually all you need to do is stand firm and explain the reason why you need it off, which is because of religious observance. You need it off because of a closely held belief that you need to observe the commandments of God and one of the commandments being the Sabbath. So usually all you need to do is just stand firm in your resolve, even if they've already told you that they can't do it. They know, generally speaking, they know that there are laws that are protecting you, and so they are all too in a hurry to avoid trouble. And so even if you're not threatening them or anything like that, and once again, don't threaten them or anything, just explain to them that you need it off, and generally speaking, and from all the situations that I have talked to people who have been in these situations, they have said that that alone has resolved everything. That once the religion situation was brought into the picture, once it was explained that it's a serious issue and that we are standing firm in our resolve to observe, and we are standing firm in our resolve to observe God's commandments, that's all it takes. That usually the employer will immediately say, okay, we will accommodate that. That's all there is to it. And once again, regardless of your opinions on these laws, regardless of your opinion of the EEOC or anything like that, we have employment laws in the United States that protect us. And depending upon your country, if you live in another country, you may have employment laws that protect you as well, but you'll have to check that out. So regardless of your opinion on these laws, we need to actually use them to affect our mindset and use them to ensure that we are observing the law. Because what's important, more important than political ideology or anything like that, is our observance of God's commandments. So we have employment laws protecting us and allowing us to do that in this country, so let's do it. No one is forcing us to break the Sabbath or anything like that. No one in the United States, to my knowledge, has a gun to someone's head and says to work on the Sabbath. We have laws that protect us in the United States, so use them. Thanks for watching this video. If you are not already subscribed, make sure that you do so that we can stay in touch and so that you'll be informed of new videos and new discussions, new issues that we'll talk about. Feel free to like this video and to share it with anyone you know who could benefit from this knowledge, who could benefit from the awareness that, yes, U.S. employment law is on our side and that we have options in the case that an employer wants us to work on the Sabbath. That usually what will resolve it is standing firm and explaining to them why we need the day off. Usually it doesn't require anything else, and usually we can get this. So thank you for watching. Remember the commands. Peace.